Well, thank you all for coming here today. And before I get started, I really do want to lend another sincere note of appreciation to both Corey and Gene for putting this together. Would you all join hands one more time and thank them? Thank you, Gene. Thank you, Corey, wherever you are. What I'm going to do is talk. I've got some written comments here, some things that I've wanted to say for some time. I mean, I've really circled this date on the calendar. I am so happy to be here in Graham's hometown and maybe present just a little bit of a different take on this story. At least that's what I hope. I'm also going to do a few readings from the book, short readings, and then I'm going to hear hopefully some of your stories. Again, if you would just let me know if you either played with Graham, went to school with Graham, you're a family member of Graham, if you just show of hands one more time. Look at that. I'm going to hear some great stories today. You probably got better stories to tell than I do. By the way, if you would give one more round of applause to my best helper who's hiding behind the screen here. He's my tech man, my 12-year-old son, William. Come on out, William. Come on. Shyness, I don't know where you got it. I became interested in Graham Parsons' story because it has such an obvious link to Central Florida's rich music history, some of which is represented here today. Not only did they play with Graham, Graham played with them. But the thing that struck me was that nobody was really talking about this aspect of Graham's story. There was always something else. As I researched Graham Parsons, I found an uncommon amount of cynicism, revisionism, and in some small cases, having nothing to do with anybody in this room, self-aggrandizing hype. Much of it centered on the tragic and unfortunate series of events surrounding Graham's premature death at 26. I also read about how he threw his life and his talent away because of how he died and his lack of work ethic. The spoiled grandson of a millionaire Winter Haven citrus magnate, John Snidely, who never knew hard times and had a constant stream of trust fund money to fall back on. I read about how Graham Parsons grew up in a life of Southern privilege and mansions and didn't have to suffer or work for success. And we know most of that, if not all of it, is untrue. I heard a well-known musician say that Graham couldn't sing, play, or write. We beg to differ. Yeah. Bottom line, I found that people seem to resent Graham Parsons' posthumous fame because of how he got it. And many people out there who claim to be scholars judged him harshly for dying young, far more harshly than other legendary musicians like Hendrix, Joplin, Morrison, Amy Winehouse, Kurt Cobain, Elvis, or Hank Williams. Historians call Graham's music California rock or country rock, and yet they seem to gloss over where it really came from, the South, and here in Winter Haven, right here in Polk County. And in a way, we need to do a better job of letting people know about the rich and wonderful contributions of musicians from Central Florida in general and Polk County in specific. We need to let them know of the contributions that they made to the world of contemporary music and entertainment. We let our rich cultural heritage at times be overshadowed by all things tourism. Bottom line, I was looking for some sort of redemption in Graham Parsons' story. Less about the hype and sensationalism, more about the rich fabric of the definitive places that he called home. The people with whom he played and those who carry on his legacy. That's why I wanted my book to be a song of the South, Graham's story rooted in places like Winter Haven and Waycross. Not LA, not Joshua Tree, California. More about the music and influences, less about his sometimes undeserved persona as a drug-addled cosmic cowboy that we've heard so much about. I in no way desired to contribute to the mythology surrounding this so-called legend of Graham Parsons, which I think largely is nonsense. There's a much greater story here. The book is not and was never meant to be hero worship. I wanted it to be straightforward, literary journalism with a distinct flavor of the special places that gave rise to so many important musicians and entertainers, some of whom are in this room today. So if you will permit me, I'm going to do a short reading from the book, giving you that sense of where we are and where Graham came from. What lies ahead is an examination of Graham Parsons' own cosmic American roots, planted deeply within the Georgia Red Clay and here in the Florida Mayaca. Take a trip to rock and roll's most important region, the American South. Wait and listen for all those forgotten, far-off voices crackling in via AM transistor radio. Remember the sweet smell of citrus, hickory, and evergreen wafting through the air, slight and vague, but cherished like a distant memory. Run the dusty back roads and orange groves with barefoot children. Climb on top of the boathouse and gaze at the stars framed through strands of Spanish moss. Come along now to a long-gone era in the Low Country, with a few detours to points northeast and west, like the Okefenokee Swamp. That's where we're headed. Doing the research, I found out that Graham was like Forrest Gump. He always seemed to be in an interesting music scene at an important time. That's why I was interested in exploring in greater depth. I dare say that this approach is why many important people in Graham's life and career decided to open up. As a result, there are a number of revelations and surprises in this book. So even if you think you know the story, I dare say there may be a little bit more here for you to discover. And it's certainly fair to ask, what's the big deal about this guy? Never had a hit song. In fact, it's quite likely you may have never heard one of his songs on the radio. His albums didn't sell that well. So why would Rolling Stone vote him one of the top 100 artists of all time? Why are his solo records with Emmylou Harris, blending old school country and contemporary rock lyrics with attitude, regarded as 5-star classics? Early on in the book, I try to answer that question. It's far too simplistic to say that Graham Parsons is the father of country rock. Many artists share that distinction. Beginning in the late 1960s, Parsons spearheaded the cultural desegregation of both idioms. At the height of America's generational firestorm over Vietnam and civil rights, his vision helped heal the bitter divide between the peacenik hippie rockers and the conservative America love it or leave it crowd. Given his musical, freewheeling young adulthood and upper middle class Southern upbringing, Parsons was an amalgam of both. In 1967, Parsons recorded what is regarded as the first full-on country rock record, Safe at Home with the International Submarine Band. Our friend sitting in the front row, John Cornell, added his steady drum beat to that classic record. In 1968, he brought his bold and risky creative vision to the most important and influential American band of the 1960s, the Byrds. When that confederation split apart in 1969, still at all of 22 years old, Parsons co-founded the archetypical country rock band, the Flying Burrito Brothers, with ex-Byrds co-founder Chris Hillman. Years later, Parsons hit his stride as a solo artist with a Southern musical soulmate, a then unknown folky singer from suburban Virginia, Emmylou Harris. I don't know if I'm playing with fire or if I'm even doing the right thing, Parsons once told an interviewer. I think I am. When people see the long hair, short hair, people with overalls, people with their velvet gear on, that they can all go to the same place at the same time for the same reason, that turns me on. Right at the front of the book, let me see if I can show you this. Right at the front of the book, I chose this wonderful black and white photo of 19-year-old Graham. This has never been published before in a book. And there's a really interesting quote from one of his classmates at Harvard at the time this picture was taken, and it goes like this. A close, Parsons looked to my own sophomore eyes remarkably self-assured and confident. He was lean with longish dark hair. He was good-looking and cool. Holding my books, I felt a certain amount of awe and envy that a contemporary could be so far along that road to the American dream we grew up on, the path to being Elvis. And that quote helped me realize the enormity of the impact that young Elvis had on youth like Graham, who when he was all of 9 years old saw Presley at City Auditorium, and one of the pictures flashing up here is that venue. That experience changed his life. From that point, nothing mattered. Graham was going to be a musician and blaze a path to music stardom. And when I looked more closely at the concert Graham saw that February evening in 1956, I realized what a constellation of stars he saw that night, and how that would never ever happen again in a small southern town. Graham and his little sister Avis enjoyed the benefits of being from a moneyed upper middle class family in Waycross until 1958. Graham had recently been sent away to boarding school, a military school for young men at the time, the Bowl School in Jacksonville. You can imagine, for a young, free-spirited kid into music, the daily routine of drilling and marching all the time. He had to hate that. There was trouble in his parents' marriage that I'm sure many of you know about, leading up to a very tragic event at the end of that year that people still speculate about today, the loss of Graham's biological father, Cecil Coondock Connor. Fortunately for my research, Graham's niece, Avis Johnson Bartkiss, was kind enough to open up to me about that tragedy. And she also gave me access to her mother's unpublished memoirs, where she talked about that event. So this gave me a never-before-published source on Coondock Connor's loss from his daughter's perspective. So you can imagine she's speaking for Graham as well. It was 1958. It was Christmas. And I think she would have been about all of maybe 9 or 10 years old at the time. And she said, "I did not cry, for Mother said I must be brave," she wrote. "Nobody could comfort me. Nobody knew how. Coondock should have left instructions, but he didn't. So I was left to find comfort from somewhere inside myself. Dear God, please make Daddy come back. But Mother said he'd never come back. So I revised my prayer. Dear God, please bless Daddy and tell him to wait for me." And there's a lot of Avis's memories throughout the book, which gives you this first-person sense of what it was really like. So it's not going to be from somebody else's perspective. You're going to hear it from her herself. For Graham, this was a period of extreme anguish. He was away at school at the time. The man he looked up to and counted on was gone with little explanation. He found little comfort at bowls and became basically such a disciplinary problem that he was dismissed and asked not to return. His friends say Graham developed a fatalistic view on life and told them he expected to die young. This episode's an example of why I bristle when I hear people say that Graham had such an easy life, and it was so carefree, and that money must have bought happiness. After the loss of Coondock, it's as if the Connors of Waycross evaporated. Graham's mom, nicknamed Big Avis, moved them to Winter Haven, back here to start over. Within months, she caught the eye of New Orleans businessman Bob Parsons. As the two pursued their romance, Graham became more and more immersed in music. It was his lifeline. But he could not have found a better place to pursue his passion than Winter Haven. Country Music Hall of Fame songwriter Bobby Braddock, as many of you know, also grew up in Polk County, just down the road in Auburndale. And I quoted from his own memoir, called Down in Auburndale, because I found his description of growing up here so apt and lyrical. He says, "In my memory, the music was everywhere, as if it were being piped in through the trees and coming up through the cracks in the sidewalks. Rock and roll was the music of the young, and we couldn't imagine ourselves or the music ever growing old. Because I had fallen in love with country music, my favorite rock and roll was by the artists who had country roots, like the Everly Brothers, Jerry Lee Lewis. I think I loved music so much that one kind of music wasn't enough for me." And soon after Graham moved to Winter Haven, he met a like-minded friend, Graham was maybe 12 years old at the time. This is 1958, 1959. And since we're lucky enough to have him with us today, Jim Carlton. Jim, I'm just wondering if you would talk a little bit about what it was like meeting Graham at the time and developing your mutual affinity for music.